There is a certain kind of person who will explain to you at length with great confidence that psychiatry is not a real medical specialty. He usually does this while taking Tylenol or Advil, whose dose was determined by precisely the same statistical principles he is unknowingly slandering. I want to talk about the statistical system he is indirectly attacking because the misunderstanding behind people dismissing psychiatry is not really about psychiatry at all. It is about what science is, what it can actually do, and the two unglamorous ideas that quietly hold the whole structure together: probability and a continuous variability. But more about that later. We'll start with defining what we want from science. We have a bad habit of speaking about scientific theories as though they were sacred objects handed down to be defended. They are nothing of the kind. A scientific theory is a view, a perspective on how some slice of reality behaves, and it earns its keep by being exceptionally good at three jobs, and only three: explaining, predicting, and influencing. That is the entire contract. A theory that explains beautifully but predicts nothing is literature. A theory that predicts but grants no leverage over the world is a gimmick. A theory that does not explain anything but is able to predict and influence is just a lucky guess. The theories we keep are the ones that do all three, and the moment one stops paying its rent, it is evicted. And we do not keep any of them for long. Every scientific theory carries an expiration date. It holds its position only until a better performing theory walks through the door, and then the old one is retired unceremoniously and without nostalgia. The geocentric cosmos lasted well over 1,000 years and was discarded after Copernicus in 1543, and the people who finished his argument came up with a better explanation. And that was the heliocentric theory of the solar system. Phlogiston was perfectly respectable until Lavoisier discovered oxygen in the late 1770s, and a better explanation for the burning phenomenon. Newtonian mechanics was the most advanced theory of gravity, and it was still amended by Einstein general relativity in 1915, and confirmed by Eddington's eclipse observations in 1919. Notice what the last example tells you. Newton was not a fool who got it wrong. Newton was the single greatest practitioner the field had ever produced, but his prior success conferred his framework exactly zero immunity, none. This is the part people get backwards about sociology of science. It does not matter who produces the theory. It does not matter how decorated, how senior, how previously correct that person was. A lifetime of correctly uncovered natural laws does not grant you the right to have your next claim accepted on your authority. The Royal Society, founded in London in 1660, has on their coat of arms the creed nullius in verba. That means take nobody's word for it. The phrase is lifted from Horace, who had been making a point about refusing to swear allegiance to any master, and the Society's fellows repurposed it into the foundation of modern science. You may be Newton himself, and the early Society's fellows included him, and you will still be asked politely to show the experiment. Reproducible observation or reproducible experiment, or kindly step aside and let someone who has that evidence to speak. So, the three jobs. A successful theory explains clearly and logically how a phenomenon unfolds, what the causes are, what are the consequences, which deeper laws make it develop in this way and not in another. That is the explanatory test. The third, the most important, though it is rarely treated that way, is influence. a theory powerful enough to indicate the methods by which we can push a predicted outcome in one direction or another. That is the prize. Notice the order, because it is not the order people instinctively expect. Explanation feels like the noble part. It is in fact the cheapest. Prediction is harder and worth considerably more, but the crown jewel, the thing that makes the scientific method the most powerful instrument of our species has ever built, is the capacity to take a predicted outcome and bend it to our purpose. Consider nuclear fission, which obeys this hierarchy almost too perfectly. Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann split the uranium nucleus in Berlin in December 1938. Lise Meitner and Otto Frisch supplied the explanation a few weeks later, in early 1939, and gave the process its name. Marvelous work, and on its own, a footnote. The explanation by itself would light no city and end no wars. But what mattered came next. Enrico Fermi Pyle, beneath the Chicago squash courts, went critical on the 2nd of December 1942, demonstrating prediction and control in a single afternoon. And then influence arrived, wearing its two faces at once, the reactor that powers the city and the device that erased Hiroshima in August 1945. The same physics pointed at human benefit or at human harm. The science did not become real when we understood fission. It became consequential when we could steer it. A theory that only explains is a museum piece. The scientific method is so brutally successful precisely because it refuses to stop at understanding and insists on results. It became so successful, in fact, that it is now worth counterfeiting. And being counterfeited is the highest compliment that fraud can pay. You wrap an action in the vocabulary of science, a few real, deliberately incomplete facts, then generously marbled with falsehoods, the lies and the exaggerations quietly doing the structural work, while the genuine fragments stand at the front providing the alibi. And then, in a flourish that ought to be funnier than it is, the same operators will frequently turn around and attempt to discredit the very method they have painstakingly impersonating. They want the prestige of science with very little work. Keep that maneuver in mind, because it is the exact maneuver used against psychiatry, and it's worth learning to recognize it instantaneously. Now bring the scientific method into medicine, and psychiatry sits squarely inside medicine, a point I intend to hammer until it stops being controversial. Here the method acquires a character it has almost nowhere else, because its object of study is the human body, and a human body is a riot of variability. Most of the phenomena physics likes to advertise are, at the scales we care about, gratifyingly deterministic. Drop the object, time the fall, do it again tomorrow, and get the same answer. Biological processes do not behave with that courtesy. Any outcome you can name in a living person, a blood pressure, a mood, a fasting glucose, a response to a particular molecule, is the aggregate result of hundreds of thousands of smaller component processes, each carrying its own tiny, unrepeatable variation, and those variations compound as the cascade runs. The product is genuine, irreducible randomness, built into the system from the start. This is not noise in our instruments that better instruments would remove. Gene expression itself is stochastic. Identical twins diverge. The same drug at the same dose produces a spread of responses across people who look interchangeably on paper. That has a hard, unsentimental consequence. When the underlying process carries real randomness, you cannot predict or influence an individual outcome with certainty. You can only work in probabilities. This is why medicine speaks the way it does, in relative risks, survival rates, in the number of patients you must treat to spare one event. A clinician offering a treatment is making a probabilistic assumption on your behalf and, if honest, says so. Medicine that claims certainty is not being honest. The second complication is, if anything, the more irritating one. The outcomes do not arrive sorted into tidy bins. They lie on a continuum with an effectively infinite number of possible values. Blood pressure does not present itself as high, normal, or low. It presents itself as a number with as many decimal places as your instrument is capable of picking up. Mood is not good or bad. It is a position on a vast continuum. Science copes with this the only way it can. It carves the continuum into arbitrary categories, converting a continuous variable into a small handful of discrete ones. Because discrete categories are the only things we can count, compare across population, and act upon. The convenience is real. So is the arbitrariness, and it produces the corollary that genuinely upsets people. The demarcation line between health and disease is, in its essence, drawn by hand. The extremes are never in dispute. Nobody convenes a panel to decide whether a man in a diabetic coma or a person in a florid psychosis is unwell. It is the boundary between two extremes that is manufactured, and it is manufactured by a procedure not revealed by nature. Who does the manufacturing and on what basis? A group of medical experts looking at three things and weighing them against one another. The subjective distress the patient reports, the degree to which the condition impairs the person's ability to function, and outcome studies. The hard longitudinal evidence showing which states reliably lead to serious harm later on. That is the machinery. It is not a scandal. It is simply not the fairy tale of a single bright assay that glows red for disease and stays dark for health. And the most instructive thing you can do is watch this machinery operate in the most respectable, least controversial areas of medicine. Take diabetes. The American Diabetes Association lowered the fasting glucose threshold from 140 down to 126 milligrams per deciliter in 1997, and the International Expert Committee endorses a hemoglobin A1C cutoff point of 6.5% in 2009. Defensible numbers, evidence-informed numbers, and numbers chosen by people, scientists, but people nevertheless. Take hypertension. In 2017, the American College of Cardiology and the American Heart Association moved the line from 140/90 down to 130/80, and several million Americans became hypertensive overnight without one of them feeling a thing differently the next morning. 4 years before that, the prior framework had already invented a whole intermediate country called pre-hypertension. Then take chronic kidney disease, defined in large part by an estimated filtration rate under 60 for at least 3 months. 60 a round and human number. Or take the single purest specimen of an entire argument, osteoporosis, which the World Health Organization defined in 1994 as a bone mineral density 2.5 standard deviation below the mean of a healthy young adult. Think about that. The disease is, by definition, a coordinate on a statistical distribution. It does not get more honest about its own construction, and it does not get more arbitrary than a diagnosis that is literally a number of a standard deviation from a reference mean. This is not an exotic problem at the edge of medicine. It is the ordinary system. Every laboratory reference range you have ever been handed is conventionally set at the means plus or minus 2 standard deviations of a healthy population, which, by simple arithmetic, defines roughly 5% of perfectly healthy people as abnormal before anyone has examined them. The line between a normal hemoglobin and anemia is a World Health Organization convention. 13 grams per deciliter for men and 12 for women, not a fact of nature. Now, against that backdrop, look at what psychiatry actually does, and then try to tell me with a straight face that it is doing something foreign to the rest of the medical system. Psychiatry, lacking for now a laboratory test for most of its conditions, defines illness as an aggregate of symptoms that must occur together above a minimum count for a minimum duration accompanied by distress or functional impairment. The DSM-5 published in 2013 will not call an episode major depression unless at least 5 of the 9 specified symptoms have been present for at least 2 weeks. It asks 6 months of excessive worry before it will say generalized anxiety disorder. It asks roughly 6 months of disturbance with at least 1 month of active symptoms before it will say schizophrenia. You may reasonably ask, why 5 symptoms and not 4? Why 2 weeks and not 10 days? And the honest answer is that those thresholds were set by a committee weighing subjective distress, functional impairment, and outcome data, which is line for line, gesture for gesture, the identical procedure used by Diabetes Committee, by the Hypertension Committee, and by Osteoporosis Committee. The psychiatrists are not running a defective imitation of medicine. They are running the same medicine with the same additional dignity of saying out loud what the others perform more quietly. And the company psychiatry keeps, in this respect, is impeccable and entirely mainstream. Fibromyalgia is diagnosed by the American College of Rheumatology's criteria, 11 of 18 tender points in the 1990 version, a widespread pain index in the 2010 revision, with no blood test, no scan, no biopsy that confirms it. Myalgic encephalomyelitis, also called chronic fatigue syndrome, was defined by the Institute of Medicine's 2015 report as a specific cluster of symptoms persisting at least 6 months, and there is, prominently pointed out, no confirmatory laboratory finding for it either. Migraine, irritable bowel syndrome, tension headaches, every one of them diagnosed exactly as psychiatrists diagnose, by pattern, by frequency, by duration, by the exclusion of subclinical cases. And yet, nobody convenes to argue that migraine is not real. Nobody publishes a smug essay claiming irritable bowel syndrome is a fiction invented by the gastroenterologists to line up their pockets. The double standard reserved for psychiatry is not a scientific position that has been argued and won. It is a prejudice that has learned how to dress in a lab coat. None of this requires pretending psychiatry is where it would like to be. Measured by imaging and assay, it is, frankly, in its infancy. There is no blood test for major depression in the way there is an A1C for diabetes. And the honest practitioners say exactly that without flinching. But infancy is a stage, not a verdict, and the rest of medicine is littered with thoroughly respectable diagnoses that were purely clinical for decades, and in many cases still are. Multiple sclerosis leaned for years on clinical criteria before MRI was given a formal diagnostic role. Alzheimer's disease was, until very recently, a bedside diagnosis that could be confirmed only on autopsy. Parkinson's disease, until very recently, was a clinical diagnosis made by a physician watching a person move. The presence or absence of a glowing biomarker is a fact about a specialty's set of tools and its place in the queue of scientific history. It is not a referendum on whether the suffering that specialty treats is real. So, let me return to the gentleman from the beginning, the one calmly explaining that psychiatry is not real medicine, while cholesterol acceptable range, blood pressure ideal values, then bone density parameters, were every one of them produced by the identical statistical machinery he is dismissing. The honest description of medicine, all of it, top to bottom, is this. We are dealing with probabilities and continuous variables, drawing useful lines that we know to be partly arbitrary and standing ready to revise every one of them the instant a better theory comes along, and never taking anybody's word when accepting or rejecting a theory, only reproducible clinical experiments. Psychiatry is not the embarrassing relative seated at the far end of his family of medical specialties. It is simple, the member of the family most willing to tell you honestly what everyone at the table is actually eating. Nullius in verba, take nobody's word for it, and that includes the word of the man who just told you psychiatry isn't medicine.